And we are live.
All right.
Um, Josh, welcome to one of my very new live streams. So this is a work in progress. Good to see you. How have you been?
Been all right. It's pretty hot here in Charleston, but honestly, wearing the linen like it's so much better than a lot of modern clothes. Now, if I had a wool coat on, it'd be pretty bad, but this is actually pretty nice.
Yeah, it's everyone the wools are always so hot, but actually it's quite nice to get a chance to wear some linen, especially if you find out like after reenacting how well the linen does and
Oh yeah,
just keeping yourself cool.
no, absolutely. I do like all my yard work now in just a linen shirt and wide brim hat. Just it's so much more comfortable than anything else, really.
Well, as one does. Well, Josh, if you'd like, let's see if we can get anybody in here real quick. I didn't tell anyone I was launching, so we'll just kind of take it as it goes. If you want to just tell us about yourself and your book, The Modern Musketeer, and how did you get into doing what you're doing?
Yeah. So where to start? I watched the show Turn, really, is actually where it all started. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. There's no 18th century kind of stuff there. And then I joined the Navy and was stationed here in Charleston about 8 years ago now, 8, 9 years ago. And there's like, all this cool history. I'm going and seeing all the sites. And then I start watching the series Turn, which is about George Washington's spies in New York. And historical inaccuracies aside, I thoroughly enjoyed the show. And I didn't know anything about the 18th century at the time to even notice historical inaccuracies. Um, Abraham, or what's his name? The guy's beard. Um, I forget the character. Caleb Brewster. That's what it is. Caleb Brewster and his giant beard. Um, but no, I watched that show and I was like, I want a flintlock. And so I went around to all of the gun shops in the entire area, and I had already done enough research to know that um, I wasn't gonna be able to afford like a nice custom, really high quality, correct piece, but I also didn't want to get like a traditions or um, Thompson Center or something like that. I wanted one that was like could be conceivably historically accurate to the 18th century. So I went around to all the gun shops in the area and asking around, like, "Hey, do you have flintlocks? Do you know anyone?" Of course, nobody has flintlocks just lying around in their gun shop. But one gun shop was like, "Well, we don't carry any, but we know a guy who makes them." And so they gave him my number. He calls me, and we talk on the phone for a little bit. Turns out he's also a submariner turned flintlock gunsmith. And so he's like, "Come on down to the shop, and we'll shoot your first flintlock and just kind of go from there." And that's where it started. From then on, I was apprenticing under him, and he taught me everything that I know about gunsmithing. Really, um, for a few years, I'm just kind of doing some research here and there. Started working on my first build while I was stationed on a boat up in New England. Um, but then came back down to South Carolina, where I really started to learn a lot more techniques. Started, making a bunch of springs, making parts myself. Started to get into repair work, um, and I also had gotten into reenacting up in New England, um, and that was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed it. But eventually, these two worlds collided where I knew just enough gunsmithing to be dangerous, and I was hanging out with a lot of reenactors who were having issues with their guns. And
Yeah,
someone would be like, "Hey, my gun doesn't spark," and so I would say, "Oh, let me see if I can take a look at it." And I had no idea what I was doing. Um, but that slowly over time, I start getting tools. I start taking these modern gunsmithing techniques that I learned from Mark, um, and applying them to 18th century tools and methods. And it eventually just kind of picked up some steam, and that's when I got the workbench and the toolbox here and got, you know, some original 18th century tools and started doing a lot more research on that stuff, and then just setting up as a gunsmith at events to do work on reenactors' guns. So it was kind of a long, kind of fell into it backwards. You know, a lot of people, they're like, yeah, I want to be a reenactor, and then they kind of learn about the guns. And for me, it was, I wanted a gun, I wanted a flintlock. Who knows about flintlocks? Reenactors do. So.
And are you the only one that reenacts being a gunsmith at events? I think you like, for those that haven't met you or seen the pictures, you actually bring a table to look historically accurate. You're working with historically accurate tools to fix reenactors' flintlocks. It's actually pretty awesome. You have a little sign, I think, as well. So
Yeah.
you're acting as I guess as gunsmith is the correct term then, because trying to get.
Yeah, gunsmith, armorer, artificer. You know, I've been trying to do some research more onto the actual field armorers that, you know, we're with the army. As far as I know, there is one other person who I'm helping get set up north. But as far as I know, I'm the only person right now who is going to events and setting up with the explicit purpose of working on reenactors' guns and working on them pretty exclusively with period tools. You know, 90% of what I do is with these right here. It's just a set of needle files. That is like most of what I do at an event. Sometimes I'm making flash guards. Like this is a little custom flash guard for a bridleless lock that goes on the feather spring instead of the you know, instead of this screw right here, right? When you put a bridle on there, then it kind of binds everything up. So on this lock, then I can come down like that, cover it. You know, I'm doing sometimes cleaning, sometimes just teaching people how to take care of their guns. But it's my focus has been on military arms. Like what does a gunsmith for the military do? What kind of challenges do they face being in the field versus having a shop, you know, where they've got their whole forge and they've got full complement of tools. And so, you know, there are plenty of gunsmiths who go to events and they set up and they have amazing displays. I've seen gunsmiths go and they're building guns. But as far as I know, I'm the only one who's focusing on repairing them in the way that I think a field armorer would have. The only image of a gunsmith in like Anglican, you know, colonial America or England that I know of from the 18th century is this gunsmith, this armorer who he's got a wagon. He's set up in a British military encampment in London, and you can see him kind of working on a bench inside the wagon. He probably has a leg vise on it. You can see a pair of bellows that's kind of sitting out behind it, and he's got this like 20-foot tall pole with a gun on the top. And I'm like, that's it. Like I have to do that. It's, you know, it's exactly what I'm doing, right? He was a gunsmith set up in a military camp to work on the soldiers' guns. So, you know, that's exactly what I'm trying to portray.
Well, we got the first question from you from Jacob Ayers.
Could
right. Joshua answer if he knows what was the kind of money a gunsmith could make in colonial America and post-War of Independence America? Could you make a fortune doing it, or was it a middle-class job?
So both, really. I mean, it's an artisan's, you know, it's a trade, and there are real high-end gunsmiths in the 18th century. A prominent one I can think of is Joseph Manton, who made, you know, guns for English lords and the king. I mean, you know, right there on his trade card is gunmaker to the king. And this guy was selling, I mean, he was living large for most of his life. But in the 18th century, they treated debt a little differently. I think, than we do now. And he actually died poor. So even though he was making these real high-end guns for like very wealthy clients, lived a fairly wealthy life himself, he ended up dying poor. He probably would have been very wealthy if he'd been able to manage his wealth. And there's some kind of stuff with the British military going back and forth. But that's on one end, is you can make a lot of money with the real high end stuff, custom firearms for nobility and hunting and that kind of stuff. And that was maybe to a lesser extent here in the colonies. There were some really good gunsmiths. You look at the high art of the Pennsylvania long rifles and some of the like top gunsmiths there. I'm thinking, during the Revolutionary era, like George Schreier Senior, and these beautiful guns with all of the engraving and the carving, and those are absolute masterpieces. I don't know a lot about their finances, but I imagine that they were doing pretty well. I mean, J.P. Beck was prolific. He used dozens of guns of his survive. His workshop made tons of very good firearms, and so I imagine that they were doing decently well. So to sum it all up, they're probably middle class to upper middle class. You might have some that are mostly importing. Most of them imported their stuff from overseas, the locks and the barrels at least. It runs a huge gambit of things. I do know that a rifle in 1790s, there's one ledger from, I want to say it's Tennessee, maybe Kentucky, shows like rifles being built for $10, I think, $10 to $20, depending on how fancy it is. And then you see fowling pieces being made for less than that, 2 to 5 even. So wide range even in one gunsmith shop between what their customer wants.
Yeah, because I remember from my research about the French guns, it was about $6 to buy them from the French, but it was about 10 to 11 to make them here in the States.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that was by design, right? We weren't supposed to be making end user products here. We were just the raw materials, right? We were supposed to be harvesting iron ore, turning it into iron, and really not even making a lot of it into steel. Certainly not producing firearms. The British did not want us doing that. They wanted us to send everything over to England, where they turn it into all the cool fancy stuff and sell it back to us, so that we're buying it from the London and the Birmingham and the Sheffield gunsmiths over there, which ultimately was more economical for a long time, because you'd have one shop here with maybe a couple of apprentices. Their ability to crank out a hand-forged lock and a hand-forged barrel and stock it and make all the hardware for it is just not going to be able to compete with the ability of the gunsmithing centers like Birmingham, where you've got the lock forging shop, the lock assembly shop, the polishing shop, and then you've got the stalker, the engraver, all of these different. It was very, very highly specialized, and so it was almost like it's cottage industry, but it's almost like factory assembly line. It's just that it's all split into these different buildings and all that. But so because of that process, they had a distribution of labor and the highly finely tuned skills. They were able to just produce stuff much cheaper than we could, at least until after the revolution, where we really, or during the revolution even, we are trying to build up our industrial base as quickly as possible.
So here's a question I have. So my Pedersoli Shortland musket, the mainspring is broke, it cracked. Say I'm in the field. Is there an armorer or gunsmith at the regimental level? Is it at the brigade level, or is it completely out of the organizational chart? And it's like a sub sort of special H&S company sort of thing?
Yeah, so it depends on the army that you're in. So if you're with the American Army, you have the quartermaster's department under, I want to say it was Benjamin Lowers for the first part of the war. And there's kind of this power struggle with him and Henry Knox. The artillery typically was in charge of the logistics of an army. So he had the traveling forges. He had a lot of those supplies with under his command. But for the most part, I think our firearms would be, the defective firearms would be sent to these depots. So for the American side, I don't know of any like embedded field gunsmiths. There is one letter that I've seen from, it's either from George Washington to Knox, to Henry Knox, or the other way around, but it's the American camp. They're camped for, I think, the winter, and it's asking for borax so that the gunsmiths can repair guns. So borax is flux for welding, or I think you can also use it for brazing. So what that tells me is that those traveling forges that we know that Henry Knox had were there at the military camp, and they were working on arms, they were working on repairs, and they were using borax to repair broken parts. You know, I've seen components archaeologically dug at Fort Michilimackinac up in northern Michigan, and you can see evidence of brazing. In fact, this walk right here, actually, this is an original from the 1750s, I believe, and the front portion here, where the forward lock bolt goes in, is actually brazed on. So I can see there's brass back behind here. I might, send some pictures if we want to post that later, but there's brass there where this piece was brazed back on. So they did that a lot. Depending on where your mainspring broke, they would either have to forge a new one, or maybe they could braze it. They usually tried to repair stuff first. I've even seen a barrel that they tried to braze back together. And then, archaeologically, they found this burst piece of a gun barrel at Fort Michilimackinac, and you can see the brass where they had attempted to braze it. So clearly that didn't work. But other areas where brazing does work is right here on the frizzen. That's a relatively commonplace, or refacing it, they'll braze on new pieces of steel. I've seen the cock brazed back together. I've also seen the tang, the tang where there's the plug and then the flat part on top. I've seen that brazed back together. So that's probably the first thing that they would do. The Americans would send that over to one of these quartermaster department depots, or to the traveling forges in the American camp for that to happen. The British haven't been able to figure out exactly what they did. I've got some books that say, Cuthbertson says, hey, it would be really great, regimental commanders, if you had a gunsmith in your unit that could do this stuff for you with a portable forge and a set of tools. I don't know if that actually happened here in America, or if it ever happened, but it was highly encouraged by him, and I think Thomas Symes too. The Germans, I know, had traveling gunsmiths with them. They had gunsmiths who came over with spare parts. In fact, their regulations say have so many spare parts for your guns, and they kept their firearms serviceable, throughout the North American campaigns. I wish that I knew more about their equipment. I don't know if they had traveling forges or not, or if they did, what they would have looked like. But they definitely had traveling gunsmiths with some amount of tools to do repairs, because the regiment von Bose, which is one of the regiments I portray, their gunsmith was in New York while they were down here in Charleston, and their gunsmith died on the way down. He died of sickness. So it doesn't bode well for me being a gunsmith in von Bose, but the effect of that was that their guns all wore out, and they were one of the only documented cases where the Germans were issued British arms. So they actually got either Longland or Shortland Brown Besses when they resupplied in Wilmington. So whatever their gunsmith was doing, they were able to keep their guns serviceable for like 5 years. And as soon as he died, then they needed to get new firearms issued to them. They were probably on their last legs a little bit. But, that just speaks to whatever those gunsmiths were doing. They were doing some Herculean stuff to keep the weapons of, a 500 soldier regiment working.
So they probably had like you mentioned a wagon earlier. Would you have a wagon and then certain parts you'd be taking along with you for on campaign, but are there certain parts that you would have to make in the field, or is it just like, I need a mainspring, I need a hammer spring? I would assume that you would have those kind of mass produced, and then you would file them down, right, to fit the individual pieces.
Most likely, it's hard to say. I need to look into some German documents and try and translate, what they've got, and that's hard. But you can only go so far for like pre-making parts. In fact, I have a number of like cast pieces that I bring with me to events. These are just like as cast pieces. Kind of similar to like if you had a rough forging, but just the nature of a flintlock and the nature of their manufacturing methods is you can only go so far for hand fitting it. Like I can't even drill this hole unless I know how wide the bridle is on that particular lock. I can't square off this hole until I know where the half and full cock notches are on the tumbler. So
that's the cock. Can you put that closer to the camera? Actually, I want to see that. So that's okay. So that would be your rough.
Yeah, that's just a casting. They would have had forgings. They weren't casting steel like this, but it's fairly similar to. This is a little more refined, but you would have something similar to this if you were trying to have roughly forged parts.
And the reason you don't have the hole drilled in is because it's going to be so unique to each piece.
Yeah, most
more or
likely.
less. Okay.
If everyone is using the same musket like you would have in the German military, it's possible that they could have gotten away with using some dies or some verification plates, some like quality control check. I've seen a set of them in a Swedish military museum. It's basically just the outline of like a lock or the outline of various pieces, and it's just if you fit it through it, then it passes, kind of thing. And then you've got some forged dies where heating up your metal white, bright yellow or white hot, and just pounding it into that forged die, and that will get you pretty close to the same shape every time. But I don't know enough about the German gunsmiths or really any of the field armorers to know to what degree they were bringing in spare parts versus just having metal stock on hand and shaping it. Of the repairs that I've seen, it's mostly trying to fix things that are broken, or makeshift solutions rather than creating entire new pieces. For example, I just got to see this was pretty cool. A original brown vest lock that was used by I forget the regiment, but a regiment of Highlanders that served in Charleston. And this spring, or rather this spring right here had broken. It broke at the hook right there. That's a bad place to break. That's really, really hard to fix. And this, like, real brave gunsmith forge welded a new hook on. So he's got the hook, and then there's like a taper, and he forge welded it right there. And the other thing that he did is that they lost or broke this screw right here, and they actually riveted it. It's actually on that lock, that original lock. Instead of having a screw in there, that spring is riveted into the lock plate. So they just took a little piece of metal and they stuck that in there, and they just smashed it down with something hard on the back until it's stuck. So they didn't have the pieces. He didn't have the means to make a new screw. That requires a tool called a screw plate. I've got one of those right here. This is original, either 18th or 19th century. They didn't really change much for a very, very long time. This design is anywhere from 1600s, maybe even 1500s, all the way through. But you need one of these in order to make those machine threads. even if you have one of these, there's no guarantee necessarily. You'd hope the gunsmith would have it all matched up, but it would have to match the threads in here. So yeah, they just took that and riveted it in place. And what that means is that that lock could never be fully disassembled to clean or maintenance properly. So they were doing whatever they could to get that firearm back in service. They did a ballsy forge weld and they riveted that spring back in. They said, "Here you go. Get back in the fight, trooper."
Well, that kind of leads to my next question. Was the individual infantryman expected to be able to break down his lock all the way and do his own sort of minimal repairs, or was he most like, hey, just take this to battalion or take this to quartermaster and he'll help you out, buddy?
Yeah, so I have seen people and sources kind of go both ways. Cuthbertson says that the corporals and sergeants should ensure that all of their men can take the lock asunder and put all its pieces back together. So that tells me, to some degree, they're taking the lock apart. In order to clean this part up in here of black powder fouling, you really have to be able to take off your main spring or your feather spring here and your hammer or your prison and take off the cock too, to be able to really scrub and get into all that. So that at a minimum, I think, was probably expected. If you don't ever take that off, it gets pretty bad in there. The private soldier and militiaman's friend in the list of equipment that a soldier should have, he says you need your spring clamp. And so, he doesn't go into details, unfortunately, but the only thing a spring clamp is for taking that pressure off, so you can take off your hammer, or depending on the type of spring clamp, taking off your mainspring there. So on that side, they're probably doing some disassembly for maintenance. Highly unlikely that a private soldier would have any clue how to start troubleshooting this. Apart from being taught how to change out their flints, they're probably not getting taught anything and would have no real experience with the tools or the knowledge to be able to work on these. And so on the other side, I think von Steuben's manual and at least one or two other British manuals say, don't take your lock apart.
It's not worth it.
Yeah, not worth it. You'll lose the pieces. Don't do it. In certain cases, soldiers are responsible for their gun. So I think it's in the British Army. I had read, again, in probably Cuthbertson, if your gun misfires twice and you don't take it to your commander to say, hey, my gun is malfunctioning, you can be punished for that. So that really contrasts with our perception of these, where they're saying, hey, if it misfires twice in a row, something is wrong, go get it looked at. They really expected these to be pretty reliable. And on another book, it's this gentleman, George Bolton, who's he created his own special lock. It's super fancy and expensive, but he's trying to talk down the normal flintlock. And in one point, he says that the soldiers are unfamiliar with which way to turn a screw. But his design, this feature, it doesn't matter. They can turn it either way, and it doesn't matter. But he's, it's kind of exaggerated, but he's saying, like, soldiers don't even know which way, they don't know righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. So if the assumption is they don't even know that, then they're definitely not taking apart all of this stuff and putting it back together.
I know in the reenacting world. Oh, sorry. Yeah. In the reenacting world, we use these quite often. How is this? Yeah, the musket tool.
Yeah.
Is this? I mean, as much as we can say, could you expect a private soldier to at least have one of these with him? Is this
100%? Okay. Yeah, 100%. Every private soldier is going to have their musket tool and their worm. These are the basic items that every soldier needed to have in order to operate the gun and clean it and maintain it. So this is your ability to take the lock off. This is your ability to turn the to replace the flint. Likely, this is also your ability to strip the outer part of the lock. and your worm here that screws onto the end of your ramrod mixed with your toe. That's going to be how you scrub out the barrel. And these are all listed under the necessary items for a soldier. And of course, there's shortages, especially in the American Army. There's entire regiments that don't have worms or musket tools. The Americans start to use, I don't think I have it here on me, but they use one that, they use these as well. These are, I think, pretty universally found in British and American camps. But the Americans also use one that looks kind of like a bottle opener. It's basically just like a single blade with a forge welded piece. So the round, and it forge welds down there. I have one, but it's, probably in my cartridge box, honestly. And those are, a lot of them are stamped U states. So that musket tool was United States property, issued to the soldier, expected to have it to be able to care for their gun. And so those are like basic tools. They also call for hammer stalls being part of the necessary equipment of a soldier. So, hammer stalls are historically accurate. They had them in the 18th century. We've got a lot of pictures of them. And it's one of those few things in the gun tools that I actually know what they look like. A lot of the not a lot of information about the specifics out there, but those are your basic tools that every soldier has.
I guess we should kind of really, we got 16 people on now. So if you
Oh,
just
wow.
want to say, you actually wrote a book about this. So if you want to plug your book,
Yeah.
and your whole sales pitch that you gave to me at Camden a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
about reenactors cleaning with ballistol.
Yeah. Well, reenactors cleaning with ballistol is not the worst thing in the world. As long as you're cleaning the lock at all, you're kind of a step above the rest. So when I started working on guns on site, one of the first things is someone will bring me their lock and it'll be coated in rust, and they'll say, my lock doesn't spark. And I'll go, well, yeah, of course it doesn't spark. It's coated in rust. There's not a speck of oil on it, and the geometry is all wrong, or the flint's not sharp, or it's not installed correctly. So as I was, trying to just get the right tools for myself, I was doing all this research and trying to dig into how did they take care of their muskets? How did the private soldier learn and take care of these arms? And so that's where this came about, the Modern Musketeer. So, I drew from like 24 different books and manuals and letters. Private soldier and militiaman's friend is there. Essay on shooting, so some stuff from like hunting manuals as well. And even some German and French things too, just to kind of compare and contrast what things are different between nations, what things are the same. And so going through, my thought with this was that you could hand this to anybody using a flintlock, whether they are brand new or whether they've been doing this for 40 years. And I've handed it to both, and the guy doing it for 40 years is like, yep, this is everything that I do, and learned a little bit in there too. And the guy who's brand new can take this and go from 0 to 100. We start off with number one, basic firelock safety, right? Because if it's not safe, then you have no business being around black powder. So it goes through all the basic safety, the philosophy of it, keeping your barrel clear, making sure that half and full cock work. But then we go into the names and parts of the firelock. How does this lock work? What are the different names? How do they interact with each other? That kind of helps set the groundwork for being able to do a little bit of basic troubleshooting. Knowing what is it that the sear spring does? What is the point of that, the frizzen spring? We go into a little bit of history about the development, not much. It's really just kind of an aside. And then we go into probably the most important part, the soldier's accoutrements, where, we talk about not just this type of turn screw, but also these guys, spring clamps here. and go over, hammer stalls, lock covers, muzzle stoppers, all of these things that I have documented to the 18th century, and how to use them as well. And not just documented to the 18th century, right? Because the context is important, but, Germans used hammer stalls that were like this. The British used hammer stalls like this. So I really try to, as much as I can, be specific where I can or generalize where I can't. Talking about the appropriate oils that you can use on your gun. That one I dove way into a rabbit hole. I'm talking learning about oxidation numbers, drying oils versus semi-drying oils versus non-drying oils, and then going into a whole deep dive on, okay, what oils were present in the 18th century. It really does just boil down to olive oil. If you look in an 18th century English dictionary, the literal definition of oil straight up was the juice of olives. So
Really?
when they say
they imported it, they imported olive oil all the way from the Med.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, 18th century they had, they have a huge international trade going on, and they were importing tons of olive oil into the colonies. You think of like all the wine and all the goods we were importing from England. So yeah, olive oil was kind of the default if they just say oil your lock. But I've seen orders from George Washington saying, hey, take all of the cattle bones, the leg bones from the cattle that we're slaughtering, and go boil them down and make neat's foot oil so that the men can use it on their locks. Or there was a court martial where a sergeant had stolen some pork, and they're like, "Why did you steal this?" And he goes, "Well, I was rendering the fat to oil my lock." So he was using hog's lard to oil his lock. So I'm diving down into really like what can I document, because there's a ton of we'll just call it tribal knowledge in the flintlock world, and a lot of it is fantastic, excellent experience that's been passed down for ages. And some of it is not really harmful, but not necessarily true. And some of it is just straight up bad advice that you should not do. I've seen various oils get recommended that you should never touch a gun with. Vegetable oils like any canola oil or anything like that. And I talk about all the different oils that not just the ones you should use, but ones you should never use, because they dry into a hard. When you touch an old bottle of vegetable oil and it's sticky, imagine that inside your lock. So not great. But so, moving on with the book, I wanted to focus a lot on for the soldier, what is it you need? How can you get rid of your Walmart cleaning kit and use period correct historical techniques that in a lot of cases work better. My unit, the 2nd South Carolina Regiment, we were using like some, Walmart cleaning, some modern gun cleaning kit. And then I show up and I'm like, here's your brick dust, here's your leather scraps, here's your olive oil, and immediately converted everyone because it just works. It worked better. But we go over a little bit of stuff for the armorer if you want to have an armorer in your unit. Go into some cartridge making for both British and French style cartridges. How to keep your gun working during an event. I don't go into drill. Plenty of other things talk about drill. This is just about how do you keep your gun firing when you're in the middle of a battle. And then into cleaning and stowage, probably the next big part after your tools and accoutrements. Everybody's got their method of cleaning. This is one that is, tested by me and my unit out in the field, but also is straight out of 18th century documentation. So, nothing crazy fancy. Water and oil are your friends there. But then we go into some common mistakes, some basic troubleshooting, and then my favorite part, which are the illustrations. So I did.
Drew that, right? Yeah, look at this.
Yeah. So I did these illustrations by hand, all to look like original copper plates, and they're all of original tools. So I didn't want to be derivative of anything, of copying copies. So wherever I could, these are all original or patterns, like the hammer stall pattern, the lock cover pattern. Those are obviously modern patterns based off of the descriptions that we have. But a series of spring clamps, and inspection reports for arms. That matches the. This actually takes a inspection report from Cuthbertson, and I modified it to match the national park standards. So if you follow this, you go through the list on here, then you meet all of the national park standards for black powder demonstrations, and then a little bit on musket stowage. So how do you treat your gun after everything is said and done, and keep it safe, and get it ready for the next day.
In absence of leadership, take over and write the book.
I mean, truly, I was surprised that there was not already something like this. As I've been trying to look into this stuff, there are a smattering of guides. John Reese's articles on the care and maintenance of firearms in the Continental Army was a huge, kind of starting point of oh, there is a way to find out how they did this. And from there, it just sort of ballooned into just vacuuming up every little scrap of documentation I could find, from how they did repairs to how they were cleaning, and even from kind of unorthodox sources, right? Like that book that Bolton wrote on how crappy flintlocks were. One of the things he talks about is, he says, hey, when you go into full cock, sometimes it just slips off. Sometimes the sear can't go in there because the soldier's brick dust is in the way. And so, well, right there, I know that they were cleaning the inside of their lock with brick dust. Another
brick
thing.
Dust? So, question.
Yeah.
Brick dust. You're just taking a brick and you're smashing it into a soup? Like, what are we doing here?
Pretty much. This is one of those kind of those things, the tribal knowledge that was passed down that wasn't really harmful, but it didn't really make sense to me. Where we say the bricks have to be pre-industrial bricks, or they got to be pre-18 whatever, or pre-19 whatever. I've seen about a dozen different years that is like the cutoff date for what your bricks have to be from, and anything from what it's made of to usually saying it's too hard. But diamond dust exists as a polish. So ultimately, all you need is something that is fine and consistent. And yes, earlier bricks, 19th century and 18th century bricks, are easier to grind into that fine dust. But I've done it with modern bricks too. And I polished the butt plate on my musket 1, 2, 3 strips with a 19th century brick, like a modern paver, and like just some red brick from Lowe's or something. And if as long as I did my part when I was making the dust, they were indistinguishable from each other. But it is harder, to get that fine dust. But if you sift it, or if you just make sure that you grind it up correctly, then yeah, any brick will do. And if you'll permit me to leave camera for a second, this is what I use: just mortar and pestle. I break up little chunks of brick with a hammer, break them down a little bit more, and then I just grind them up here in a mortar and pestle. You don't need a lot. I'd say about a tablespoon is probably all you need for like a season of your own cleaning. But you're just taking little scraps of leather and wiping some of that brick dust on there with your olive oil, and just polishing down, just scrubbing off all the rust. And that's really all that is. But that is like the number one thing that the soldiers were doing to their guns, is they were taking little scraps of leather, they were taking their brick dust and their olive oil, and they were polishing their guns and keeping them nice and shiny.
Would every soldier have olive oil? or was that?
Um,
I know it's hard to generalize like on these sorts of
yeah,
questions. I'm just kind of
it is.
this is all new
I
to
would
me, so I'm
expect,
really interested.
yeah, I would expect that you'd probably have one guy in the mess. Like maybe, you'd have corporals and sergeants. Your NCOs might be the ones carrying your oilers. It does show up in the list of basic in the list of the equipment of a soldier. There's oiler. There's
Okay.
punch in. Punch in is a pin punch, so that's how they'd be taking off their barrels. Um, and so it is hard to say. It's not unreasonable to think that every soldier had a oiler, but they probably didn't. They probably were sharing. I think there's an American account of everybody having to like share a single worm. They're passing around one worm for everybody to clean their guns. So probably things like that happen pretty frequently.
Okay. Yeah, Hardy asked, was the olive oil more of a mandatory purchase for the privates or was it a military issue? Sounds like more towards the latter, more like a military issue.
Depends on how organized your army's logistics are. For the British Army and probably for the Germans as well, it's probably an issued item. Their supply lines were intact. They were the ones importing a lot of the olive oil, so they probably didn't have too much trouble getting it. But as you could see from Washington's army, one soldier gets court-martialed for trying to steal hog fat to oil his lock. And Washington is given orders like, hey, boil the calves, don't throw away the calf bones, boil those, get the neat's foot, give it to the men to oil their locks. So I think for the most part, it's being issued to the soldiers. They may be purchasing it privately if they know what they're looking for and have the money to do that. So probably a blend of both, leaning towards it being issued.
Crockpot Broccoli asked a question. I know we kind of mentioned this, but just to catch everybody up, lard or tallow would suffice. And then he says, I'd be surprised if any military units operating in the 18th century America would have had any olive oil. But you had mentioned the olive oil earlier being part of the, because that was my question actually earlier as well. Like olive oil from the Mediterranean ending up over here seems just a bit like a stretch.
And Don
Well,
decided to join us for a second. Say hello to Ren. Found me in the garage. Yeah, so olive oil was pretty common. It was a household cooking item. So it is reasonable to think that that the soldiers would have had olive oil, especially on the British side, but even on the American side, they probably would have had some access to olive oil. But as we saw with Washington's orders and other things, they had to look for more different sources for that. Sorry, there was another part to that, and then I got distracted.
Oh yeah, it was the lard or tallow.
Lard or
I'm
tallow.
guessing those are different types. Yeah, lard from fat. Tallow is that from a tree?
They're both from fat. Lard is just rendered pork fat, and tallow is rendered beef fat.
Okay.
And both of those were used as well as bear grease. So animal fats are non-drying, but they tend to be solid at lower temperatures. So they were used, but a little bit more for rust prevention than like oiling. You could kind of grease your lock with the animal fats, but if it got down to cold temperatures, those become solid and really will gum up. So you don't want to oil a lock with just straight lard or tallow. And I know a lot of modern gunsmiths or flintlock operators use mixtures of like beeswax, tallow or lard, olive oil to make a sort of kind of just thinner consistency paste that works better at lower temperatures. A lot of us hunt with flintlocks in the winter. But there are some specific use cases like this guy right here. That is the plug to a Ferguson rifle.
Oh, we're gonna play the guess. We're gonna play the guess what gun. Guess what pieces in the background.
Oh, well, yeah. Oh well, it's got the hole in it. You can see right there. But for this thing to work, this was lubricated with tallow. I think it was a mixture of beeswax and tallow. I'd have to look back at the reference. But so, you know, it has a place, kind of depending on the application. There is a rust prevention recipe that shows up in a couple different places for a mixture of hog's lard and camphor, which is from a tree. It's a waxy substance from a tree that has some rust prevention qualities. Also smells really nice. And graphite. And you mix these components together. You lather it all over your iron surfaces, and then you leave it for 24 hours and you wipe it off. And it says in the recipe that it keeps rust off for 6 months, but I mean, it works pretty well, but I haven't tested it quite for that long yet. But you know, that's another use that they had. They were using tallow, or not tallow, but that was hog lard on the lockets, or on the metal parts.
I know we can't touch it because of the YouTube rules, but Crockpot Broccoli brought it up. The Ferguson, he says, "Holy crap, this dude has a Ferguson in his shop." Well, Mr. Josh, if you just want to tell us about your Ferguson without touching it.
I will. Well, I already took out the coolest part of it here. So me and a friend of mine, we actually portray Ferguson's rifles. They were a real short-lived unit, pretty much just the summer and fall of 1777. They show up, they do some damage. Ferguson gets wounded at Brandywine. Then the men go back to their respective light infantry regiments. And then that winter, all the rifles are put up into storage. And we don't know what happened to them at that point. There is some evidence that some of them might have made it south for Ferguson's Corps of Loyalists, but we haven't found anything conclusive about that yet, but certainly not in the numbers they had at Brandywine. So they had green coats, black hats cocked on one side with a big feather in it, and you know, they loaded from a ball pouch and a horn. And you know, these guys were light infantry with really one of the most advanced weapons of the 18th century. And it wasn't entirely Ferguson's design. You know, this idea was probably 60 to 70 years old by the time of the Revolution. They figured, wow, they were trying to figure out breech loaders pretty early, but he was the first one to make it operational, and that's key. So he did a couple of things. First, he made this plug here. It has 12 starts. So that screw there, rather than just one thread going around, it's got, 11. It's got 11 threads all going around simultaneously. And what that means is, for a single turn, I get the travel as if I had turned 11 times. So instead of having to spin this thing around 11 times, I go once and it drops a full about 1.5 inches or so out of the gun. Now, the other key component to this is, with that distance of travel, if I had just one thread going around, then you wouldn't have enough material strength left to withstand the pressure. So not only does it drop very quickly, but it also maintains the surface area as if it were more tightly wound to be able to withstand that pressure. So that is one of the key things, is you know, the number of starts on there, being able to hold that chamber pressure, while also operationally, all you have to do is one turn to be able to drop your bullet in, pour your powder in, one turn to come back up. The other things he did is, this is actually tapered. So this has a slight taper like that. That's to help with the seal, kind of like a pipe thread, if anyone's familiar with that. And then the other thing is, he's got all these notches cut into it. He's got a notch right there. He's got this flat here. He's got a notch cut in there. He's got a notch cut in there. And what those are doing, they are cutting through fouling. Those are channels to cut through the fouling so that this thing doesn't lock up. If you don't lubricate these, with the tallow and beeswax, you'll get maybe 3 or 4 shots off before you got to start hitting this thing with a hammer as if it were a Mosin Nagant. So, any Mosin firers, you've got your ammunition, and then you also have your hammer for operating the bolt. But if you lubricate this, and with those grooves in there, this thing can shoot all day, no problems. And so that's what turned this from just like a curiosity, that's kind of cool. You can load from the breech, but kind of useless. You only get a couple of shots, and then you got to clean it, and it's finicky. To a true weapon of war, where this guy can fire 6 aimed shots in a minute. He can load on the move. In his demonstration to King George, he poured water down the barrel and then loaded it and fired. He was doing a lot of stuff to impress these guys, to the point that they said, okay, we'll make 100 of these on the King's dime. These were, I think, 3 times more expensive than a Brown Bess, and took quite a bit longer to make. And you had only the top gunsmiths working on them, like Dur's Egg. So yeah, very, very specialized, very capable weapon, 2-foot-long bayonet, super cool uniform. So as a gunsmith, and one of my closest friends in reenacting, he's like, hey, let's do Ferguson's, and I'm like, yeah, okay. Twist my arm. Completely useless impression. I don't recommend anybody do it, because you only get to use it at like 2 different events, but it's just way too cool. I mean, this is some incredible machining that would be hard to do even today.
What so it's a rifle, right? So it's shooting what's the caliber of a Ferguson?
They fire a 6.15 round ball, I believe. It's either 6.15 or 6.1. I got to look back at notes again,
Yeah.
but basically the standard British carbine round.
So you have a Ferguson, and I have a Hull behind me, so we have
there you go.
Some breech loaders. Would you call a Ferguson? That'd be you're loading from the breech. Technically, it's a breech loader. Okay, yeah.
Absolutely, breech loader. Yeah.
I don't know if they had some other different sort of namology. 100 of them were made. I think I can remember that information. And then, do any of them still exist? Do we have original Fergusons?
Yes, there are a couple. There's one at Kings Mountain. There's one at the Smithsonian, and
Okay.
I think those ones are actual Ferguson rifles. The Museum of the American Revolution has 2. They have one of them looks like a civilian model. It's not fitted for a bayonet. Could be a rifle, an officer's weapon. Another one that I got to see in the collections room is definitely some officer's plaything. Not one of the ones that Ferguson bought. It's made by a different lock maker. The design is slightly different, but it is fitted for a bayonet. And it is the Ferguson action and all of that. So
we don't know why at the end. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying there are a couple out there, but it wasn't just Ferguson making these. So that breech loading design stuck around, and there were some of varying designs before the war as well. But as far as his rifles, I think it's just the 2.
Why? And you kind of mentioned it. Sorry, but at the end of the '77 campaign, they're put away in storage. But Ferguson and his unit. Does his unit get disbanded? I know Ferguson dies at Kings Mountain.
So 77, the Battle of Brandywine, Ferguson gets wounded, and so he's kind of taken out of action for a while. His unit was always supposed to be, it was experimental. It was always supposed to be kind of a temporary thing. And all of those men were borrowed from different light infantry regiments. So when he got wounded and the campaign season ended, everybody just went back to their units, and logistically, it would have been too difficult for them to keep using these Ferguson rifles in their respective units. So at that point, it makes sense to take those, put them up in storage, hand them Brown Besses, probably with the expectation that a new company would be fielded, but they kind of get lost to history at that point.
And do we know, I don't know if there's an after action report about how well they fared. Like, what have you read
Um,
about like field use, or is this
so
magical weapon everything that we built it up to be, or is this like, just give them the standard musket? It's not.
I think they lived up to the hype. I haven't read all of Ferguson's writings, but he talks about a couple of different engagements. They're kind of doing the Forge Wars a little bit, the end of the Forge Wars in early '77, and then they performed great at Brandywine. So not a whole lot of data points, but from the accounts that we have, it seems like the men did great, and the weapon served them well.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I know you're showing it before the stream began, and it's hopefully I'll
so
see.
pretty cool.
Will you be at Camden this year?
Yeah, it should be at Camden.
Okay, I'll try to make it down to Camden. You should bring that thing out. We'll
Yeah,
record another video. Uh,
well, I'll definitely
so
have
for
it
those that
for Brandywine.
For those of us that have joined us, we have Josh Shope here. He is a reenactor and gunsmith that does gunsmithing and armory work at reenactments. So you bring out a bench with all the tools and you repair reenactors' pieces, and it's pretty awesome. And you've just been telling us about the book that you wrote, The Modern Musketeer. I've linked to that in the description down below. We just got done talking about the Ferguson rifle reproduction you got in the back. One of the questions that came up, if you have any questions, drop them in the comment section. This is the guy to ask. He's the expert. He wrote the book, literally. And one of the questions that came up earlier was, what is the most dirty gun that you worked on?
Oh boy.
What's the
Um,
worst? Jacob Ayers, what's the worst musket condition you've ever seen at a reenactment? Name that reenactor and his unit. Just kidding.
yeah. There have been some pretty bad ones, but one in particular stands out. Maybe two. Um, I've seen plenty of like rusted locks. That's not too unusual. A lot of people are really scared about taking their locks apart, which makes sense if you don't want to damage it. Um, but one of them, this gun, overall not the worst condition, but I'm working on something else, and I look at the stock and realize that the stock is cracked down the wrist. I mean, like straight through. The only thing holding this thing together is like the tang screw and the trigger guard. And this guy was like still fielding with this thing. Unfortunately, he didn't live fire with it, but someone actually captured my face on camera the moment I realized that this gun had a huge crack down it.
Was it
Um,
a pepper spray? Was it like an India-made gun? Was it a
Indian made Potsdam. So
okay?
unfortunately for the German reenactors, who mostly use Potsdams, almost exclusively use Potsdams, even though that was a Prussian gun, and the Hessians didn't really have the Prussian guns. There's some differences, but pretty much your only options are rifle shop or Indian. And so the vast majority of Hessian guns I've worked on, they're all Indian guns. And yeah, that is a problem though that can happen with any gun. We call it musket grain. It's when the grain, instead of running down the wrist here, just shoots straight back like that. And so your force is not being transferred properly down the wrist and into your shoulder, but you're starting to get this, this shear. So instead of like this, right, where you're able to transfer that force this way, you're kind of like this, and your grain will shear. And that's why you'll see gun stocks that crack in a straight line right through that wrist. It's when the grain goes straight through instead of kind of curved
Yeah.
down. So that's one part of the equation. The other is that these guys in particular love the Prussian drill. They slam their muskets down. They're, really snappy with their movements. Looks beautiful. Horrible on the guns if you do that on concrete or asphalt or anything like that, or ultimately even grass, if you do it for long enough. So that's one that was pretty bad, mostly just because he didn't know how bad it was. The other one, which is probably is the worst that I've seen, was some carbine piece, and the lock, you know, completely rusted, has never seen a drop of oil. But I'm going through and I take the barrel out, and, you know, probably never had the barrel out, caked with not just rust, but like just layers of, I don't even know what, hard wax or wood or dirt, something, completely rusted on the underside of the barrel, and I think it did not have any barrel lugs. It was either that or it had one. Might have had one barrel lug, the furthest one back towards the lock. And so the only thing holding that barrel into the stock was a single barrel lug and a tang screw, and that was it. And he had a sling swivel on the fore end of the stock, and the sling swivel, they should always go to the barrel. So it's never just a hole through the stock with like the swing, you know, your screw through there. There should be a tab that goes through, because that weight needs to be taken up by the barrel, not a half an inch of wood. And so not only was this guy's sling swivel going just through the wood instead of the barrel, but it was unsupported wood. He had probably like 1.5 feet of unsupported stock because there were no barrel lugs with this sling attached to that. So if you had tried to pick this gun up by the sling, it probably would have just cracked the stock right in half. That's probably the worst one that I have seen, that the owner had no idea just how bad it was.
Were you able to give him some like pins to hold the stock in then?
I made him, so this was on site. This was at Rural Hill, I think. I made 2 new barrel lugs, and I had one on hand too, and soldered those on for him, and you know, got that all repinned, and then said, don't ever use this sling swivel. I'll put the sling swivel back in there. You know, I cleaned up all the rust, cleaned up the lock, got it all good and sparking, but said, do not put a sling on this thing until a lug is installed here for that to go through, which I didn't have the means to do that at the time.
Well, at least the reenacting world gives you a lot of good stories.
They do. Yep, they do. Most of the time, people know how bad the gun is, but.
So you helped me last year because I bought that an American Charleville that was a reconversion. So that was upsetting, but it was very helpful to find out somebody had taken it from. I made a video about it before, actually a couple videos. Someone took a flintlock that was converted to percussion, then reconverted it back, and then used like a modern milling machine on the inside to kind of work that lock. So made a video about that. So thanks for all the help on that, Josh.
Yeah.
What is something that you're working on now, or like where is your research taking you? On your Facebook and your Instagram, you have pictures of all the research that you do, and so you can kind of follow along. So it's in the description for your Facebook and Instagram. Go follow that if you want to see all the pictures. Somebody asked to see, we need to see this picture. I don't have an ability to share a picture from my end, but the picture of the German gun with the broken stock. Is that on Facebook?
Yeah, it is. Maybe I'll share that story to bring it up. Yeah, on the Shope Arms page on Facebook, I have a couple folders. One of them is just every single image that I have found of a flintlock tool or accessory or accoutrement. It's all of this stuff. It's the spring clamps, it's worms, it's musket tools, lock cases, hammer stalls from American, German, English, French, Swedish, just every source that I can find is all in this album of musket tools. So that's kind of the main repository for that. Instagram, I post a lot of, just kind of what I'm working on sort of stuff. I've got a number of locks in here right now. So like, this is just an Indian gun that's got a little bit of an issue with the sear here. I should not be able to do that. So if you're watching, I'm at full cock, and I can just push the cock forward. So kind of an issue, but that's all about angles. That's geometry. Would love to do another video on, some of the nitty gritty details about, the inner workings in here, because it gets pretty technical with how all of those interfaces go and the vectors that the force are taking. But so I got that on the bench. This is a pretty cool lock that's in. This is a original German lock that kind of the same issue. It's slipping off of full cock. Yeah. Hefty mainspring. But this is actually for a combined rifle flintlock. Air gun flintlock. So this has like some special features that you can fire this as an air gun, or you can fire it as a flintlock, which is pretty dang cool. The owner wants to get the air gun part working again on that, which like I'm all for that. So I've got some locks that I'm working on. I am working on a portable forge. So I got the bellows here, just a little bit larger than a fireplace bellows, but not quite a blacksmith's great bellows. And that is for me to be able to do some soldering work and like hardening frisons and tempering springs without having to pull out the map torch after the public leaves. But I have a 1736 sketch of a tinker's cart, which is basically just a wheelbarrow with a bellows in it and a plate for forging. But so I'm going to make that and then probably be the only person with a tinker's cart out there that I know of. But until I can make and cart around that entire gunsmith's wagon, I'll have my bench and the portable forge, and then I can do pretty much anything. So that's in the works. I got a couple guns that I'm building. Always doing research on musket tools. I've been on a bit of a German kick, trying to track down an original musket from Hesse Castle. Harder than you'd think. A lot of guns in the German Dutch spear. Not a lot of they vary a lot. They're not as standardized as the French and British, and it gets real hard to pin down where they're from. So I've been doing a lot of digging into those. Always something going on.
Yeah, because the German and Dutch locks are more like longer banana shaped, right? Compared to the French and the English.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I can't pick it up and bring it over. But yeah, the German locks, they, it's a huge gambit, but they sort of missed the 1760s update. So, in the 1740s and earlier, everybody's using these giant banana-shaped locks. They're using wooden ramrods. They're using unbridled locks, so no little tab here on the frizzen goes through. That's called an external bridle.
Closer. I want to see it.
So see if I can do this. So that piece right there, that's called an external bridle, and those start to show up on military guns, kind of in the middle of the century. The French and the British pick them up real early. And they also switch from waist belts and swords to cross belts with bayonet and cartridge box. And the Prussians and the rest of the Germans, they get into the 1750s update, that 7 Years' War kind of look. And then they just go with that for like 50 years. They sort of skip the 1770s update that everybody else did, where the locks are getting smaller, the guns are getting lighter, the cross belts, getting rid of the swords, going from like gaiters and breeches to gaitered trousers. Everyone starts to go to those in the 1780s. They kind of skip that, and then just the next update they do, the Germans, is in the 1790s and 1800 when they start getting into the Napoleonic War kind of equipment updates. But so that complicates the German guns because they kind of just did the same thing for so long, and they all were doing it. yeah, it gets hard to differentiate. But it's definitely a vibe. I mean, the Potsdams have some beautiful carving on them, and you know, I do love just the architecture of the German locks.
The long locks. Is there a reason? I'm guessing the more refined they get, they make the locks longer to smaller. Because the 1763 French gun has a longer lock, and in 66 they go to a. I think they use the cavalry carbine lock, and then they use that lock. So I guess they're making shorter carbine guns at the
So
time too, with smaller locks, right?
it's a yin and yang between durability and material cost and weight. So you need to soldier proof your stuff. So that's why your gun locks, your musket locks are so much bigger than your civilian locks. You're soldier proofing them. Big things are easier to make, they're harder to break, and they're easier to repair. And so, you know, to a point. So the soldier guns are just bigger. They got bigger, beefier mainsprings, so that's a lot of your distance there. You know, big triggers, big sears. You know, there's just a lot to them, and it's a lot of mass that has to move. So over time, you know, the metallurgy gets a little better, the manufacturing techniques get a little better. You start to see the gun locks shrink down. It also just follows trends and you know, civilian and military trends affected each other. But yeah, in general, the military locks just stay large. You know, one will be a little lighter here. Oh, we'll save material, save weight. And then, that was, you know, now it's breaking, so let's beef it up a little bit here. They weren't doing, you know, finite element analysis on these parts. They were just like, yeah, we could probably make this thinner. And then, you know, statistically over time, like, oh, okay, that part is now breaking more. We got to beef it back up.
That's a great question I have then. So what piece of a lock will fail first from your experience and then from your reading? And does your reading back up what you've kind of seen in the reenactor world and the living history world? Do you see cocks that snap?
So
Or,
I mean, springs are typically your primary failure point on any mechanical device, that's often a failure point. You know, the temper of the springs is a very precise thing. They have only so many cyclic loads that they can do. I would say, so hammers going soft is a pretty big one. That definitely was a repair or an issue that was a big enough deal that you know, a British manual says something. It basically says, although you should get your guns in perfect working order, sometimes the hammers might need to be re-steeled. Basically saying that the hammers came from the factory soft, and you need to go take them out into town and have them hardened. So that's a common problem for me. It was a common problem for them. I also see, and the causes for this are numerous, but I see a lot of guns that slip off of full cock or don't hold half cock. That's a pretty common problem for me, and it was for them too. There's a American Pennsylvania militiaman at the Battle of Fort Washington watches a line of British infantry coming up, and he watches them go to the shoulder, and some of the guns go off. And then they give the order to make ready, and then more of the guns go off. So basically, shoulder, the half cocks failed on a couple guns, and they go off. They come to full cock, and a couple more, you know, the full cocks slip off, and the guns go off. And then they level, and a couple more guns go off, you know, just jostling it. That sear is not engaging properly. And so by the time the order to fire is given, it's just like a couple muskets go off. So, you know, that's a problem that they had, and it's a problem that I have. Is you know, that's probably the most critical thing, is making sure that full cock and half cock notch works properly.
I say I have a broken mainspring from a Pedersoli Bess, and then I have a broken sear spring. No, I have a missing sear spring for that Moroku that I sent to you yesterday. We
Yeah,
got some
and I will say, the one other thing is, this is probably more of a modern problem, but this spring right here will break right there at that bend. And that is from people using these vice grips.
Fire.
Don't do that. So the problem with vice grips on this is, if I set my vice grips here, right? Let's see if I can see this. So you can see that I've got the pressure being applied at the bend. I think I've got somewhere in here. Yeah, I've got a normal pair, or these are very large, but you know, at best, you're able to move it up, but you don't have a lot of control over where that force is going to be. And when it springs into place, if you are pushing down, if you're pushing, you know, a spring has to act along its length. So you want to push along the length of the spring. If you push down right here, it has no length to take that compression, so it cracks right there. So if you apply pressure down here when you're trying to take your lock apart, that's where it's going to break. And I've seen that quite a bit from reenactors, you know, trying to, or just anybody trying to take their lock apart and using vice grips to do it. That's what this curved end here on this tool is for. So that fits right in there, and so now you're acting at the full length of this spring. It's got all this distance for it to move, and so now you just squeeze and you take that weight off.
Okay. Can you buy those at like Track of the Wolf?
You cannot, unfortunately. This is probably my so far single greatest contribution to the flintlock world, I think, I guess, to kind of toot my own horn a little bit. But this is, I found it in a 1754 French cavalry manual and had to translate the French to figure out what this curved piece was for. You know, and that's where I figured out that it fits in there like that to take that piece off. Nobody makes these that I know of. I am the only person who does, and I am way behind on making more of them, but this is like one of my top priorities, is making more of these things, because this, which is the spring clamp that most people, yeah, exactly, yep, is a 19th century tool.
Oh, come on. Don't
I
ruin
know,
this for me.
I know. I would happily be wrong.
All right.
I would love to be wrong about this, but I have not seen any documentation for these earlier than 1790. And even with that, it was a Joseph Manton cased shotgun, and it had a tool like this in there, but that gun had been converted to percussion. So the original gun, and it still had the flintlocks with it, and it was made in the 1790s, but then it went back over to England, converted to percussion, and came back. And I don't know if that tool was original to the flintlock configuration or just the percussion version. And
what is the proper use of this? Just so people know. What are we looking at for the people watching?
Yeah, so this is a mainspring clamp, and nothing wrong with using it on a mainspring, right? It fits right there on your mainspring, and what that does is it allows you to take the pressure off of these screws so you can take them off without damaging them. It works great for mainsprings, like no issues there. The issue comes when you try and use this on the feather spring or the frizzen spring. You know, even on this massive Charleville block, I'm still, notice how, notice how close, so I have to stay out of the way of this screw here, and notice how I'm not really able to get more than like halfway down. I'm still putting pressure pretty close to that bend, and that's on a large spring with a lot of room. If I have a lock that is maybe a little smaller, like this, this French gun right here, you know, I'm even closer to that bend, and you can just tell it doesn't fit. Doesn't fit right. The arm is sticking out.
Yeah. Okay.
It's awkward to use because now you're having to compress that spring. You're putting, you know, one of your arms is acting directly on that bend there. So it's just not ideal. They are good enough. They can work, but it's not very ideal. I would almost say if this is all you have, you're probably better off taking off this arm so that you don't have that pressure point there. But so that's why I believe that these are tools of the percussion era, because percussion guns have this spring in them. They have almost the exact same internals as your flintlock. But what percussion guns don't have is a feather spring. And so a tool designed for percussion guns does not need to worry about your feather spring there. Whereas a tool designed for flintlocks has something that is more shaped correctly for operating that spring all the way down at its tip so that you can take that piece off. The Germans have, this is another thing that I'm researching. The Germans had a version of it. They get misidentified as wheel lock clamps or Michelet clamps, but it was a flintlock clamp. And I have not figured out yet from the illustrations how it works. So stay tuned for that. There'll be another new spring clamp that I'm doing some research on to figure out how that thing works.
Well, you've ruined this one piece I had. So, well, at least the other two are fine, right? You said the worm
and the musket tool, yeah.
And the musket tool. And the worm is good for dislodging stuck balls or stuck ball. I've used this a couple of times
for a smooth bore for sure. There is an original that and it's illustrated in the book, but there's an original that has a screw down the middle of the of there. So it looks kind of like, imagine this nail is it has like threads filed into it, so you can use it to clean, and it's a ball puller. You screw into the ball of a rifle, and you can pull it out. Okay. The worms are smooth bore. These are tools for cleaning smooth bore guns. You can pull the wad and just roll an undersized ball out, but a rifle, you can't pull a rifle ball, a patch ball with one of these. You would need to have a ball puller. Or unbreech the rifle, which is another thing that they did.
They took the breech out. They just
Yep.
It just screws in the back, right? It's held in by screw.
Yep. Yeah. The screw is the tang and the screw plug just screws right in the back. So you take that to blacksmith or gunsmith and just take the breech out, and then you pop the ball out down the other end. And there are some documents showing that American riflemen did that if they had to unload.
David Beiser says this has been fantastic. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Crockpot Broccoli has a question that came up a little earlier. What's Josh's advice for repairing an antique mainspring with a crack forming at the main bend?
Ooh. So you got a crack forming down here or in the bend?
With a crack forming at the main bend.
The main bend. So I would assume that that's back here. So almost anything that you would be able to do that's kind of a permanent solution would require retempering the spring. I think your safest bet, number one, would be take that spring out, make a new one. That's probably the safest thing to like save that original spring. Some other things you could do is the cracks propagate through the edge of the crack. So where where the crack is at its thinnest, stress is force applied over area. So that area is very small. So a large force gives a lot of stress, and stress is what propagates the crack. So that's why the crack will travel down like that. Is you open up another little area, and then the force just keeps pushing down along it. So you can either, without seeing it, I don't know if this is a viable way to arrest that crack, but a method to arrest a crack, if you can do this, is to drill a hole at the end of the crack. And so that takes it from this sharp thing here where you've got a really small area and the crack keeps propagating, and you put a big, large surface area. So that crack comes up, and then it reaches this large surface area and it can't propagate anymore. It's kind of like cutting down trees to stop a forest fire from continuing to spread. I don't think that is going to be a viable way for that mainspring. Another method could be to try and braze it shut to fill in that crack and hold those pieces together. Depending on where it is, you could have a shim in there. So like if your crack is like back here, and you put a shim up here, like a little brass shim, if the spring can handle it, then now instead of your spring arm working along this entire length, it's only going to work along the fulcrum of that shim. So if you can put a shim on the other side of where the crack is, that will isolate the crack from the force of the spring. That's probably the easiest thing that you can do if the geometry works out for you. But cracks in a spring, it's probably going to get you at some point. Now, if the crack goes longitudinally, you might be okay. You probably can't see it, but this is an original gun, and it has a longitudinal crack going all the way down this spring. It goes all the way down. It's almost like they took two halves of a spring and welded them together like this. Longitudinally, this spring works great. No issues in the 250-year lifespan of this gun. Where you cannot have a crack is if it's perpendicular. Your crack is traveling this way across the spring, you're pretty much done. If you look at, if it is an original, there's probably file marks on the spring, and you might notice all the file marks are either going to be going down this way or they'll be angled. Like on this one, they're all angled. They all go like this. And that is to prevent any of those, they're called stress concentrators or stress risers. Each of those file marks is like a little crack. So if they are longitudinal, then when the spring is flexing this way, your crack is like this. So it's not really flexing too much alongside that. But if your spring is flexing, I'll see if I can even demonstrate this. Your spring is flexing like this, and your crack is here, then you're working that crack. If the file marks are going perpendicular. So perpendicular, no go. Something will have to do, or it's going to fail. Longitudinal, you might be able to get away with just continuing to use it. Keep an eye on it and maybe make a mark, like put a little piece of tape, see if that crack is propagating still, or do some sort of mark, probably like Sharpie or whatever you're okay with using on your original firearm, but something to see if that crack continues to propagate. The metal doesn't know how old it is, so it shouldn't fail just sitting there, but I have seen springs fail being in cold, because cold makes a metal stiff. And so, this is under pressure. And if you leave a gun cocked, say, outside overnight in the cold, that spring can just snap because the cold is actually lowering its its ductility. So don't let it get cold. Try and keep it always stored down, right? That's the least tension on the spring. Even better if you are really concerned about it, just take it out of the gun. But if you want to shoot it, you'll need to keep an eye on making sure that it's not propagating. Check to make sure that it's longitudinal, not perpendicular. And then look at where it is and see if any of those other methods can help arrest the spread of that crack.
Yeah. Very
Hopefully
informative.
something there is useful.
All right, I'll probably go. Thanks for the info. It's a perpendicular crack. I'll try the shim method, is what he says.
All right.
Stories
Good luck.
of our history. Stories of our history says Josh is awesome. Oh yeah, Hardy asks. We'll probably go like another half hour. If that's okay with you, Josh.
Sure. I got nothing better to do.
Question.
I probably would be out here working on stuff anyway, so.
We can always come back. Hardy asks, do we know how the British feather spring tools look like? Or if the British had feather spring tools?
So they definitely had spring clamps. I know that the earliest like British spring tools that I have are from like 1800, 1810 or so. So like just getting into the percussion era, into the 1810s and 20s. And those tend to be this type. This I've seen in the Diderot, whatever, it's French, I don't care, encyclopedia, and that cavalry manual. There was one of these found at a native camp. So there was a gunsmith who was at a native camp, and in his cache, they found one of these. I don't know if that gunsmith was English or French, kind of a toss-up either way. If I remember where it was, it's more likely that he was English than French. So that's really all I've got as far as specifically English spring clamps. The other thing, though, is there's a military manual that says you can use a hand vise. I think that's the private soldier and militiaman's friend. I think the word he uses is hand vise instead of spring clamp. And this is a hand vise. This is an original one from the 18th century. This is English. It's made by P. Stubbs, who was a tool maker in Sheffield. So this is straight up an 18th century English hand vise. And there is a military manual that says you need your hand vise. It doesn't explicitly say use the hand vise on the lock, but it's certainly what it would be used for in that paragraph that it's in. And it's real simple. It's got a little spring here to help open. It's got thread here, and then your wing nut for opening and shutting. And for a British lock, you can, a little awkward on the mainspring, but you can use it on the mainspring there relatively effectively. It might actually even be easier to, if this thing is long enough and will let me, I might be able to, just do it this way, or probably better to do it this way, where I'm actually resting on top of the lock plate here. So again, similar to your feather spring, you want to be operating as far to the end here as possible. That's what's going to save your spring, is if you're pushing on it all the way down the length. And so you can rest on the top of the lock plate and the bottom of the spring there in the light. And then you can take that pressure off that way. And then on your feather spring, again, not quite as ideal as the hooked version, but you can get this pretty far up there. And because it's a screw instead of the quick snapping of vice grips, you have a lot more control. You can gently ease up on it, and you can you can make sure that you're only going as far as you have to in order to take that weight off. So just enough to get that wiggle. All you got to do is get that weight off of that spring, and then you can take it apart. And then ideally, if the locks are made correctly, when the frizzen is out, this spring should be unloaded. Which what I mean by that is, and I think this is the example I'm going to use because it's not correct. If I take my frizzen off, sorry, you can't see what I'm doing. Take the frizzen off right there. So now, see how, get the light a little better. All right. See how this piece here is still touching the other side of the pan? That means that that screw is still under pressure, and I can't take this off without clamping it. That's not ideal. The original locks that I have been able to take apart aren't like that. It shouldn't be much, but this should basically be not under pressure anymore. But if you have your hand vise, then you simply can take that. And now that the frizzen is out of the way entirely, we can get right up on there. And then we just take that down just enough to where the weight is no longer on there, and you'll feel it in the screw. If the screw's really fighting you when you're trying to take it out, probably still under spring pressure. The screw should come out nice and smooth, and then you can take your lock apart with one of these spring clamps.
And the hand vise, that's a civilian tool, just a universal tool that can be used in this instance for this for gun work, for work on the lock.
It's definitely not a
specific for firearms.
Specific, yeah. It's not a flintlock specific tool like this is. It is a gunsmith tool. You know, gunsmiths use those, and I've seen them in a watchmaker's tool catalog, 1767. You know, this thing is almost one for one, exactly the same as that. So watchmakers, blacksmiths, gunsmiths, you know, everybody use these things. They're not super uncommon. Maybe an 18th century one is, but this is probably 19th century American made, and you know, the style is pretty much the same, just a little larger. So you can find these on eBay relatively cheaply, like anywhere from 20 to 50 bucks or so. You can find one of these on eBay.
Galagus, I'll get to your question in a second. Hardy's question ties in. Hardy says, would it be safe to say that military musket tools were common enough that civilians just used military surplus, or did they have their own style of tools? So if, say, you work on rifles, did they have a different, or is it mostly the same because it's mostly same mechanism?
I think so. It's hard to differentiate sometimes between military and civilian tools. I don't have a lot of information about the tools used at places at like the state armories, the state arsenals. Like, I don't know exactly what the gunsmiths at Charleville or Saint-Étienne or Potsdam or the Tower necessarily used. But I think it is pretty safe to say that there wasn't much of a distinction between military tools and civilian tools when it came to like hand tools like this. Your civilian gunsmiths would probably have something a lot like this. Your civilians themselves might have things like this. You know, I made a much smaller one for pistols and rifles here. And you know, that's probably what they would have had, or you know, they have things like these hand vices. But you know, that's just for the hand tools. For the larger things, you know, the traveling forges, or in the big arsenals, you know, they've got water-powered hammers, and they have lathes, and they have milling machines. I mean, they have giant grind wheels. You know, there's a picture of French barrel makers who are lying on like a sled over the top. There's a row of them, and they're kind of lying on their bellies with the rifles or the lock parts or whatever. with these giant grind wheels that are water powered underneath them, just constantly going, and they're just grinding barrels. So, you know, that's the kind of stuff that the military has that the civilians don't have, that allows places like St. Etienne and Tower of London to crank out these muskets to the tune of tens of thousands of them, versus our little cottage industry that is making them one at a time with, you know, mostly these hand tools. That's where the big difference is.
Galagus asked, has Josh ever worked on Scottish Murdoch pistols?
Very briefly, yeah, I worked on one. So I've done some gunsmithing for Artistry in Motion. He supplies firearms for all kinds of stuff. He's done Turn, and he did the Patriot, and they did like Walking Dead too with modern stuff. But he's got like 1,000 different guns, and he's got a couple of Murdoch pistols, those all steel Scottish guns. They're kind of weird. They're, if I remember correctly, the lock is held in by only one screw, and I'm pretty sure that at least the version I was looking at, it was a horizontal sear instead of a vertical sear. And I don't have anything here right now with a horizontal sear, but it's a much earlier type where the sear moves in and out of the lock plate. The cock kind of hooks back into it to engage with it, rather than it engaging directly with the flat on the tumbler. So I haven't done a whole lot with those. They're very uncommon, but I do remember there being some kind of very unique things about them.
I didn't even know what it was. I just Googled it. So it's an all steel
all metal
pistol,
yeah.
All metal pistol.
Yeah, very specific style to the Scots, and I imagine it's because they didn't have a lot of wood up there, I suppose. And you know, an all steel pistol is you could use it as a club too, which they probably really liked. So I'm not really sure the design process behind why they went with that, but they're very unique.
Looks like
They're kind of doing
the French model 1777 pistol. Is that all metal as well?
Yeah, I'm not familiar. For whatever reason, for whatever reason, I don't really care much about the pistols.
Yeah, I'm on the same one.
I'll work on pistols, but all I've really, you know, I portray a musketeer, you know, in all of my impressions, or a rifleman, and they just didn't carry pistols. So, you know, they're great. One of these days, I'm going to make a pistol with detachable stock, because they did have those in the 1770s. Yeah, really cool piece. So definitely going to do one of those someday. But you know, as far as like knowing a French model 1777, or the difference between a Charleville 70 versus 77, or you know, Tower of London Brown Bess proof marks versus, you know, some private contractor, I actually don't know that much about the kind of, I'll say, collector side of things. I don't know the differences between all the different you know, all the different models, because they didn't really think of them like that. They just called it a, you know, King's pattern musket, you know, first pattern, second pattern, third pattern, or you know, it's a, you know, it's a French service infantry musket. You know, they didn't quite break it down as much as we do. And for like the repair work that I do, you know, I would love to get into like defarbing and learning some engraving and getting the stamps and that kind of stuff, but you know, mostly I'm just focused on getting the locks to spark again.
Yeah, I was reading George Muller's book, and Schmidt also talks about it, like the guns sitting in the armories and arsenals after the end of the American Revolution. It's new French musket, old French musket.
Yep.
The model system isn't quite there. It's English gun, it's Dutch gun.
Yeah, I mean, we break it down to Dutch Type 1 and 2 and 3, and they're just like, it's some old Dutch gun. I don't know.
Yeah, the system of, well, that's why the French, the model of 1766, I talk about this on my videos. It's actually how I got into collecting is that you Google Charleville and you're like, oh, that's a Charleville. Wait a minute, that one's different than that. That stock doesn't look like that. That barrel, that lower barrel band's being held in by tension. No, it's not being held in by tension. The bayonet lug's on the top. No, the bayonet lug's on the bottom. Like, what is going on here? And you know, the king would just put out ordnance, well, requirements, and they would enforce it. But yeah, so they call it the system of 1766. So it's, if you imagine them more like an AR platform, it's kind of helped me understand that. Yankee Doodle says, "Oh, sweet, Josh spreading the good word of the Modern Musketeer." Again, we have Josh Shope. How do I say? Did I say your? Have I been saying your name wrong? Shope. Sorry, Josh Shope.
Like Shope with an S.
Shope with an S. He is the author of Modern Musketeer. Link to his book down there in the description. There it is. It is a how-to to be historically correct when maintaining your musket. Is that a good sales pitch, I guess, for your book?
Yeah. And something else that I didn't even mention when I was talking about it earlier, but it's printed on, you know, textured laid paper and bound pamphlet style. So the idea for this is, this looks just like any 18th century book. It's even got the long S's. So if you're like me and you read those with a lisp, then it gets real fun.
If you don't read them with a lisp, I question you.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I print and bind these myself. You know, wrote, edited, made all the illustrations in the back are all hand drawn by me. So a lot of research and time and effort goes into each one of these.
Yep. Let's go back to a question. JR said, I always wondered, how did they hand out flints? Was it part of your rations? Yes.
Yeah.
And they actually,
absolutely.
The thing that always blows my mind about flints. So I'm holding this is a French flint. It's amber, and I recently went for the American Society of Arms Collectors conference up in Woburn, Massachusetts, for the 250th of Lexington. And we walked out to Concord, and they actually recovered flints on the hill overlooking Concord Bridge, because one of the last orders that the militiamen are given is to swap out your flints. There's references to 1778. I've read from the National Park Service. It comes from an order about having like a pound of powder, 40 ball, 4 or 5 flint. So they're required to have a set number of flints. Usually a flint can give you anywhere from 20, maybe up to 40, you know, reliable strikes. I've had some go more. And they actually imported millions of flints during the war. The French would send over guns, and then they would send over tens of thousands of flints. And I've always found that interesting, that they were just napping these out at such a mass production number. And you can buy original flints for like $5. They've made so many flints back in the day that you can still pick one up. And yeah, so that for JRW, great question.
There's actually a period reference, a Prussian military manual from the 1770s says that, actually no, it's the Hessian infantry regulation, 1767, says every soldier needs to, before a battle, make sure that they have a flint in that can get 30 shots. So they expected, at a minimum, one flint should be able to do 30 shots, which was a whole complement of, or rather that was half of their ammunition. They carried 60 rounds on them, which is just crazy. Yeah, so one flint, about 30 shots is what you'd expect even then.
Do we know if they were holding the flint in their cartridge box? I don't know if this is correct. I have this little pouch, and I have flints in here that I can pull out along with my musket tool. You can use this.
A lot of pouches. Yeah, a lot of cartridge boxes have a pouch in the front, and that's where you would have your flint and your musket tool, most likely. I don't think that they explicitly say store it in the pouch. Some do, I'm pretty sure, say to store it in the pouch, but you can put it under the block, or if it's got a pocket, you put it in the pocket. But it's kind of one of those things where it's like, that's just where it makes the most sense to be. You don't want to have it in your pocket. If it falls out, your gun is going to be useless. Yeah, two I think 2 flints, 2 spare flints, plus a wooden practice flint is what von Steuben says in the Blue Book. But yeah, they didn't really ever have trouble getting flints. For all the shortages that they had with everything else. Seems like flints were never really in short supply. As opposed to us modern reenactors, it always seems like everybody's having hard times getting flints. So I do always keep pretty good supply on hand because, one of the first things that I do when someone says, "Hey, my lock doesn't spark," is I'll look at the nub of a flint and say, "You got to change out your flint."
I mean, the sutlers there having to deal with hundreds of reenactors trying to get their yearly complement of flints.
Yeah.
Is
People ask why in here I talk about bring your spare flints. They brought them. You should too. Get your. There's several good places you can get them online. You should have 3 flints, 1 in the gun, 2 in the cartridge box will be more than enough to get you through any weekend event.
Oh, for sure. Ask Me says, I can't imagine things were conceptualized the way we do. Interchangeable parts en masse were an invention of decades after the American Revolution. Also leading to one of my worst auction buys. It's sitting over there in the corner. That 1766 musket with Henri Blanc initials on it. And a 40-inch barrel made in 1811 and a cut stock. Because I got so focused on HB. Henri Blanc was, can we consider him like him and Gruberval, sort of like the godfathers of interchangeable parts. And then we also have, when we move into the American side, we have John Hall and the Hall rifle.
And Eli
History
Whitney.
is Eli made a video about that too. It's sort of interchangeable parts if you just mark them all up.
If you just ignore the part where
for that moment in time to pass that test. For those that don't know, Eli Whitney sold the government in the late 1790s that he could make interchangeable parts for muskets, and everyone was really excited about this. And then he went to do his display. He did make interchangeable parts, handmade and fitted, so they were all within a certain tolerance, if I remember correctly. That was his first contract. So he was kind of a snake oil salesman. Check out the model of 1812 Whitney contract video. I had my hands on one back in December. I went to the Iowa Veterans Museum. We looked at one of those models. History is a foreign country. We can't delete the things we take for granted. True. And then Yankee Doodle says North Carolina militia regulations talked of powder and lead, 3 flints, and a picker. What is a picker?
Oh, yeah, we didn't even talk about pickers, which they're all on my cartridge boxes, which are back inside. But a picker is,
Is it the same
so
thing from a whisk and pick?
yes, yeah. So they called them.
Okay.
They usually called them pickers. It kind of goes back and forth. Some call it a whisk and pick. Some do just call it a picker. But the picker is just a little piece of wire that goes into the touch hole. And sometimes it was, also attached on a little like brass chain to a brush that I'm pretty sure would have been either like hog bristles or horsehair. But not a lot of originals of these. Yeah, there's one. Couple different styles out there. Now, one thing, this is kind of one of those, that's not exactly tribal knowledge, but the sutlers are not always your friend. So I don't know what kind of pick you have on there, but actually I might have one over here.
So yeah, these are useful reenacting or shooting black powder, just to pick the touch hole. They come in quite handy.
So
this doesn't really play that well, honestly.
I think they were probably hog bristles to clean that fouling off. Personally, I just use strips of linen, and this is all stuff that's in the book as well. But when you're out on the field and you're firing and your gun starts to misfire, this is all kind of in the during the battle stuff that you want to do. with like a little bit of linen or, whatever cloth, or with your brush. You want to wipe out the pan, because your pan will have fouling in it. You want to wipe the underside of the frizzen, because that'll have fouling on it. You often want to wipe the surface of your frizzen. Again, fouling. Usually not as much of an issue with like fouling as more just like burnt residue. The fouling that gets on the pan and under here, and also very important, underneath the flint. Wipe, careful, don't slice your finger open. I've sliced them, so many times, but wipe right here underneath the flint, and I'll explain why. So when you pull this trigger, your flint strikes that and it moves down the face, right? Well, what it's doing is it's scraping off pieces of steel with so much force that the steel rises in temperature and ignites in the air. So that's all it is. It's literally friction from the act of cutting off these little pieces of steel that is heating them up to their ignition point in air. So all those little pieces of steel are going to be right underneath your flint as it scrapes down, right? You're scraping down. So all your pieces of steel that you're making are here, right underneath. Well, if you have a bunch of fouling underneath here that is, taking in all the moisture from the air, you basically are just dousing all of your sparks. So if you're firing and firing and firing and your flint looks good, everything looks fine, but all of a sudden your gun is starting to misfire, you're starting to not get sparks, wipe the underside of your flint, get all that fouling off of there, especially if it's humid or if it's been like drizzling. But even on a dry day, get that fouling out from under there so that those sparks are able to just collect and then get thrown down into the pan. And that's where, too, you got to make sure the pan is clear and up here is clear, because those sparks will bounce around all over the place in here. So you want to get all that fouling out so that when the sparks bounce, they're bouncing on metal until they get into your powder and not landing in a big pile of wet fouling and getting doused. So that's what your picker and your brush are for.
Hardy.
One quick thing on the picker. You'll see sutlers selling these like square ones with a little decorative twist in them. I know they look pretty. I don't recommend using those, because when you use that in your touch hole, it's like a reamer. There are square reamers that are used for enlarging holes. So if you're using one of those square pricks, you're likely, it could be that the metal is softer than your barrel, but you're likely reaming out a little bit of material and slowly enlarging that touch hole. So what they used was just a little piece of wire. That's what I use. It's just a little, I think it's a paper clip that I bent a little circle in, and then to get around my flash guard at reenactments, I put another bend in there so I can get around in there. So just a little piece of wire is all you need, nothing fancy.
All right. Hardy says, bushcrafters tend to tout the ability of frontiersmen to make their own gun flints. Did they actually do that? Or was it just as easy to buy them next time you were in town?
Yeah, it's hard to say. My research has mostly been focused on on the military side of things, but if I were to extrapolate just how easy it was for the military to get flints, I think that by and large, your frontiersmen are probably also buying their flints. The amount of time that it would take for them to like mine their own flint, first they'd have to find a source, and then they'd have to mine their own flint and then spend all that time napping it. When they can just go to their hardware store that they do go to and just buy flints there. Anywhere is going to be selling flints. So I would need to do a little bit of digging into that, but the frontiers folk, they had access to all the trappings of modern life, less so than people in the city, but they had flints, they had china, they had a lot of the same kind of things. They wanted the frontier to feel like home. That's not always the case, and they could only afford what they could afford, but it usually was not entirely disconnected from the supply chain, of getting those flints from like the British and French flint mines.
I was just out at Martin Station talking to a gentleman that's been reenacting out there for like 14 years. We talked about this because and he's like, well, it just seemed like it wasn't that hard for them to get flints. If you needed to nap a flint, you could, but if you just go to a trading post, you could pick one up.
Yeah.
Okay, so Yankee Doodle says Sean from 6 North Carolina, and then he has a question for me. Wondering,
Sean?
Revere, do you have any other nation muskets outside of British and French? I have American muskets, but no, I have no original British guns because those are very expensive. I have 3 original French guns, 2.5 original French guns. One gun,
it counts,
has been played with to a point where I feel pretty bad about it. And I guess let's actually wrap this up talking about how we even got to this point. Last week, I posted on my YouTube channel on the comment section, my AC went out and my house went to like 100 degrees. Hence why I've moved the studio downstairs. So I got my AC fixed, but with the AC going out and I have a collection of original guns behind me and some reproductions, I was quite worried about how to preserve these, historical guns and my reenacting guns reproductions. So I got some boiled linseed oil, and I reached out on YouTube to ask best ways to protect them. And I was talking to Josh yesterday, and then I was telling him about my whole scenario, and I also sent a picture of a broken mainspring. And this is what came up. I was like, well, I got boiled linseed oil. I put that on the stocks, and I'm waiting on ballistol. I've been using CLP for the metal parts, and Josh very actively told me not to use to be careful with the boiled linseed oil, which is what I've heard. So in basically short, or if you want to expand on it, what is probably you think the safest way to store muzzle loading, flintlocks and stuff like that for long term, especially when you live here in the South and the heat, the heat and humidity?
Yeah. So the number one most important thing that you can do is thoroughly clean it after firing. If you don't do that, everything you do after that is a waste of time. So the gun must be clean. It must be dry. There can be no black powder residue. Black powder fouling, by the way, when it's mixed with water, it makes sulfuric acid and nitric acid, which is not great for metal. It's also why black powder fouling really stings when it gets like in cuts. It's because it's acid and salt. So neither of which are great things for a gun. So really focus on your area around the touch hole. Really focus on the barrel. Get everything on your lock, and then dry it and oil it. And the oil that you use, modern gun oils are fine. I don't know where it is, but I had a little bottle. Probably some of you know about these little blue bottles of gun oil that have the little like red cap on them. I use those sometimes. A lot of times I just use olive oil. I've got here my camphor and hog lard and graphite solution that I use as a rust preventative. But what rust is oxidation of metal, and it requires water for that to happen on that specific kind of metal. And the oil is blocking the water and the oxygen from accessing the metal. So what you're doing is you're just preventing oxygen and water from getting to the metal so that it can't go through that corrosion. You can probably see I brought this from inside. I actually have some surface rust forming on this right now, just from when I brought it inside. This is the thicker part of the barrel down here, so it condensed more water. Up here, there's no surface rust, but down here, I had all this little water condensation form on it, and now I've got surface rust. That stuff will brush off really easily. I'm not worried about it, but water is your main enemy. So, you know, where you want to, once you have them clean and dry and oiled, in the places they're supposed to be oiled, no oil here, no oil on the face of the frizzen, because that will prevent sparks. You know, machinists use oil when they're cutting to prevent sparks, so we don't want to put oil on there because we want sparks. But everywhere else, oil, never WD-40, not this stuff. This is a water displacement. It's great for if you dunk your lock in water to get all the fouling off and then hose it down with some WD-40, great. But then wipe all that off and put a proper gun oil on there. WD-40 is not great as a gun lubricant, and over time, if you see a gun that has been cleaned with nothing but WD-40 that gets left on for years, they don't look great. It leaves a hard film on there. I'll probably upset some people by saying that, but please do not use WD-40 as your primary lock or rust preventative. But yeah, any of the modern gun oils or olive oil, but get it inside, get it into air conditioning. Storing a gun upright for a very long time, the oils will leach into the stock, right down in a really weak area. So, on like original guns that have been stored upright for a really, really long time, that wrist is probably really dark. That's from oil just running down over time through the pores in the stock and, kind of running down towards that area. Storing them probably horizontal is the best way to do it for long-term storage. But you can store it vertically. It's fine. That's something that happens on the time scale of decades that you might actually have a problem with an oil-soaked stock getting structurally weakened. So your two things: oil it and then just get it out of the environment. Really, it doesn't need anything super fancy. In fact, this lock, this original, German lock, has been in my unair conditioned garage for, I don't know, probably, I don't even know how long. I've probably had this for 6 months or so. So this has been in an unair conditioned garage in Charleston, South Carolina. Look at that shine. I have done nothing to this except for keep it oiled. So if you keep it oiled and you don't let the corrosives get onto the metal, and the type of metal matters. Carbon steel is more susceptible to general corrosion. Steel that is not well polished is very susceptible to corrosion. All the little crevices in there are places for water and oxygen to collect and start to eat away. So it's really in your surface treatment is like the number one thing you can do. And then getting it out of out of the humidity is the next best thing you can do.
I also bought a dehumidifier. And that's always good to have.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't hurt to have all those things.
Oh yeah, the boiled, so Miniwax, not Miniwax, what is it called? Renaissance wax. A bunch of people, I talked to a friend that works at a museum, and he recommended this Renaissance wax for basically mothballing the gun, which I'll probably do for the original French musket. Microcrystalline wax polish. So I guess this, have you heard much about this? First time I've heard about it was in the last week, so I guess this is what a museum curator recommended, and then on my YouTube post, a bunch of people recommended this. But boiled linseed, I was reading about the boiled linseed oil after we talked yesterday, and they said it darkens the stock, which is why your walnut stalks almost look black now. Mm-hmm. It's just don't use. It says just to be very scarce with it. Don't put boiled linseed oil on stocks more than once a year. Just do like once, be done with it.
Yeah.
I don't really care too much about the reproduction guns. If you can tell, you can. I wonder why certain woods feel a little bit smoother, like they feel oiled in. Is that because they had linseed oil on them, or it's
Just
hard to
totally
really
totally depends. Yeah, it depends on the gun, or depends on the wood that they were used or that it was built out of. Depends on the type of finish. So like an oil based stock, I use Danish oil on a lot of mine, and I'll just touch it up like you said once a year. But some finishes are like lacquered. Those are the like really smooth, shiny ones, that if you scrape it, it leaves those horrible light gashes in there that can't be fixed. Um, so we could talk a long time about different types of stock finishes, but you only want to put oil on oil finished stocks. So like if you've got an Indian gun and it's got that lacquer stuff on there, don't put linseed oil on that unless you scrape off that lacquer and get down to bare wood, and then you can put linseed oil on there and start putting coats on to build it up, and it builds up that sheen. And the reason why you don't want the linseed oil on your metal is because linseed oil is a drying oil. It polymerizes, which means it gets hard. It turns to plastic. And so that's why oil-based stocks or oil-finished stocks, they're shiny and it's hard. It protects the wood. But it's a lot easier to replenish. You can just put more oil on there as opposed to a lacquer-based stock finish, which much more difficult to repair.
All right. I'm just going to take one more question, then we'll start
Yeah.
closing out. Carl's asked, how common were the Committee of Safety muskets? I just started reading about those yesterday. They come up for auction every once in a while, the Maryland types. Committee of
Everybody.
Safety were ways that the public was using to arm themselves. You have a Committee of Safety. You don't really know who makes the guns because they're kind of illegal. How common? It's hard to say. I mean, I would assume that they made enough for them to outfit numbers of militia, but I haven't done enough reading on that. I just started reading in on that recently. George Mueller, that's the book that's sitting on my coffee table right now. I was scrolling through that yesterday. He can probably help you out there. And then teak used on the repro gun. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So for the Committee of Safety guns, we probably talk about them more than they actually were much of a thing. We tried to build up our domestic arms manufacturing, but it just was nowhere near the scale of what Europe had. So Committee of Safety guns were the local governments reaching out to gunsmiths and ordering, copies of muskets made. Early in the war, they were kind of, Brown Bess copies. Later in the war, they became more French copies. But you see mix and matches of things, as we were getting in guns from overseas. A lot of the French guns we got didn't work. They were sending us old stuff, trying to clear out their inventory. And so we were mixing, matching parts and putting them wherever we could. And it was like a logistical nightmare. So, the majority of our arms, like what was actually getting the troops outfitted and finally getting whole regiments armed up with the same gun, with the same caliber, and being able to consolidate all those logistics, that was mostly foreign arms, especially French. The Committee of Safety guns were like a stopgap measure in the beginning of the war, that we were doing anything we could to get as many weapons on the field as possible, but they just could not keep up with the demand. So you'll see a lot of guns labeled as Committee of Safety guns or militia muskets. Some of them are from post-Revolutionary War era. There were a lot of militia laws, that came about in the 1790s, and then War of 1812. A lot of militia muskets show up then. So actual Rev War Committee of Safety muskets are pretty rare to find out in the wild.
Yep. I agree with that completely. George Mueller, I was reading, he said put like 80% of the Continental Army was armed with French guns. So there's reasons that you want one standard gun, caliber, parts, maintenance. You don't have to work on different things. The Committee of Safety guns are, because the militias are active the entire war, and there's hundreds of thousands of militia members. But yeah, so you still want Crockpot says you still do want this to finish teak. The natural oils do protect it and prevent rot, but the wood goes great. Just look at any old boat with teak grab rails and such. Oh, we're talking about the teak stocks. I had a teak stock, and I messaged you, and you helped me take off that the finish on that.
Oh. I'm gonna do this off camera so you can't see it.
Yeah. YouTube live stream has pretty strict rules on handling firearms, if anyone's wondering. We'll have to do this again, Josh. We should do another live stream. I saw that
this is a Indian brown bess with teak wood that I scraped the lacquer stuff off of and refinished with Danish oil. So I think it came out pretty nicely. I probably could do another coat on there just to kind of patch it up a little bit.
Nice.
It gets a lot of heavy use, but yeah, you can. They're diamonds in the rough, but Indian guns can be made to work pretty well. That gun, you know, we did an event a couple weeks ago, a filming. And second South Carolina, we had guys with their personal hunting rifles. We had people with their muskets that they bring to all the events, and mine was the only one consistently firing. So, you know, an Indian gun can be made to look pretty decent and work pretty decently as well, even with the teak stocks, which are a pain to try and do any carving on. But yeah.
No, that one looks beautiful. Florida Seminole War History says, I see a lot of French amber flints in archaeological digs. That's Chris from a couple weeks ago, my first live stream, so good to see you again. And he says this was an awesome video chat. And yeah, they just said, thanks for the live stream. Thoroughly enjoyed. This was awesome. Beautiful. I've made several Indian guns and very nice arms. I need to get some Danish oil, though. Yeah, the Indian guns are... having had someone help me refinish mine, it's a pretty cool piece to have them at that price range. So Josh, I will let you do the closing thoughts. If you want to do your final plug, your link to all your stuff is in the description, but yeah, let's close this out.
Yeah, so I guess final plug for my own stuff. So I do repairs. You know, if you've got issues with your lock, come see me at an event. I've got a calendar up on the website. I travel all up and down the East Coast, and I bring the whole setup. So, you know, I don't like to ship whole guns, but locks I can ship back and forth all day. You know, get stuff working. 250th is all coming up. We've got the Modern Musketeer. So almost everything I said tonight, as far as gun maintenance and operations, is in here. It's dense. Like every sentence in this is intended to be useful information to you. There's no fluff. So, you know, a lot of good stuff in there. I also, you know, make the Y tools. I'm working on being able to make worms, and I am making more of these spring clamps here. I also do hammer stalls, custom flash guards, lock covers, pretty much anything that has to do with you know, your gun maintenance, 18th century gun maintenance, brick dust, tow, all that stuff is all stuff that I tried to make available to people because I myself could not find it anywhere. So the stuff that I offer is pretty much just stuff that I myself was not able to find anywhere else. You know, please be patient. I'm a one-man shop here working in my garage, so I try and get things out as quick as possible. But you know, for a lot of stuff, the books, the hammer stalls, even the musket tools, the Y tools, I can get those knocked out pretty quick. But yeah, and if anyone has questions, just want like some consultation on something, or just want to talk locks, or even better, if anyone wants to be a armorer for their unit, I am more than happy to help you know, get you on the path for that with, you know, the first set of tools that you need, and how to kind of translate modern gunsmithing to 18th century gunsmithing tools, so you can help keep your unit's firearms working. That's awesome. Pretty much it.
Yeah, and we'll have to do some more of these. This was awesome. This was the first time. We've
Yeah,
talked about doing this for like over a year now, coming up on 2
a
years.
while. Yeah, quite a while.
And the timing hasn't worked out, but hopefully
Yeah.
I'll be down at Camden and we can do like a
And I
more
and I did
formal.
shave 10 minutes beforehand because I'm not putting this on with facial hair. So
I also shaved, even though we're not reenacting. Beards is
absolutely,
not acceptable. All right.
absolutely.
We'll try to do more of these. I'll try to get them somewhat usually during the school week, Monday to Thursday in the afternoon, like 5 to 8 p.m. I don't really have a set time for that, guys. I need to figure out how I can actually, if I know I am going to post this, give people kind of a heads up. Because right now I'm just kind of sending it out into the void and getting a couple hundred views off this already. So, but yeah, thanks for sticking through it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for all the questions. Obviously, thanks to Josh. And yeah, I'll end the stream, Josh, and then we'll just go to the backstage, I guess. I don't know what it's called.
All right, we'll do backstage passes next time.
All right, see you guys.